Hi, everyone. Andrew Wilson here. This evening, I thought I would try and fulfill a promise to my daughter Kate that someday I would tell the story, the true story, of what it was like to be in the Army and go to Vietnam. So I guess this story started back in 1947 when I was born. And shortly thereafter, I had a serious infection. I was allergic to aspirin, had a very high fever, lost all the hearing in my left ear, deaf in my left ear like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, exempt from military service because of deaf in one ear. So, anyhow, 1965 came along, and Vietnam was in the news, and 1966 came along, and a significant number of people were getting killed, and the newspapers were starting to report that the federal government was telling stories. It wasn't really accurately reporting the situation as it actually existed on the ground. So I thought that I was immune to the draft because I'm deaf in my left ear. I had a rating called 1Y, which was a deferred draft status. But they somehow changed that to a 1A draft status, and lo and behold, in spite of being deaf in my left ear, I received a draft notice of induction. And boy, I had some friends who were sophisticated and connected, and they really encouraged me to run to Sweden, all expenses paid. And they would hook me up with a pacifist group in Sweden that would take care of me once I got there. But I just thought that my future was in the United States, and that because I was so well educated in the stories that were being reported in the newspapers about Vietnam, that I could be a leader in trying to stop the war in Vietnam and to prevent future wars like Vietnam, and that it was my destiny to be a leader to end war. Oh, yeah, sure. So, anyhow, I could not, I could not, I could not stop the process of being inducted into the military. And I was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia on the 5th of July of 1967, where I went to basic training in a place called Sand Hill. And at Sand Hill, we had busloads of young draftees from Northern Virginia, where I came from, Fairfax County. And these were surprisingly upper middle class young men, sons of doctors, sons of lawyers, sons of government executives. And there they were being drafted just the same as me. So anyhow, we went through basic training, and I remember feeling tortured by the drill instructors who was forcing us to endure physical training, hour after hour of physical training. And I think I said something to him. His name was Sgt Robinson. He was like about the same color as a Hershey bar and a chocolate bar. And so anyhow, Sgt Robertson said that no, he was not trying to torture us with physical training. He was not trying to rub it in how he had all the power and we had none of the power, that we were maggots. He was not trying to do any of that. He was trying to instill in us the skills and the power and the self-awareness so that when we went to Vietnam, and we surely were going to Vietnam, everybody was going to Vietnam in July of 67, including Sergeant Robinson was going to have to go back. And he wanted us to have the physical strength to be able to endure that tour and to survive it. That's what he taught us. And it kind of took the sting out of all of that physical training. And I got to where I was proud of myself that I could do 50 push-ups. Bit bing, bit bang, bit boom, 50 push-ups. Try it sometime. And I could do it, man. And in spite of having asthma, I could run. And I could carry a pack, man. I mean, 10 miles in the Georgia heat in the middle of July. Give me a couple of salt tablets and a gallon of ice water, and I'm good to go. Seriously. So, anyhow, I think I got traumatized in basic training because what they were trying to teach us how to use a bayonet. And the sergeant would yell at us, "What is the spirit of the bayonet, men?" And the answer was, "To kill, Sergeant, to kill." And I found myself, "What is the spirit of the bayonet, men?" And I found myself yelling, "To kill, sergeants, to kill, sergeants." Well, I come to realize decades later that that's exactly what they wanted me to do, was to internalize a rage that would actually enable me to take a knife on the end of a gun and rip somebody to shreds. That's the spirit of the bayonet man, is to kill the motherfucker with a knife on the end of a gun. So they won. I lost. I guess that's part of being growing up and getting a bark on your tree. Just a little wimpy suburban rock and roller. Well, anyhow, so I'm in basic training, and I was on I had a very bad attitude because I thought that I knew a lot more about the Vietnam War than anybody at Sand Hill. And truthfully, I probably did know more about the policy. I was reading the New York Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post and the Washington Star and the Christian Science Monitor. I mean, I was reading all of these papers. I worked at a shopping center and a record store. The shopping center had a bookstore that had all of those newspapers, and they would let me read them before I went to work. Anyhow, I was reading all of these papers. I thought I knew more about Vietnam than anybody. And I had a very bad attitude. And so I was on the kitchen police, KP, more often than not. I think I must have had KP 12 or 15 times, 2 or 3 times a week. during my time there at basic training. And the mess sergeant, the guy who ran the place, uh, he was a Vietnam vet, and he had served with the 5th Special Forces in Nha Trang, Vietnam. And he kind of took pity on me. He recognized that I was doing my best to make sure that his dishes were washed and clean. And so after my 4th or 5th time on KP, he says, "Look, Wilson, when you go to Vietnam, go to the NCOIC and tell him I want to go to Nha Trang." And in the processing center when you first get off the plane. And so sure enough, that is what I did. I found the NCOIC and said, "I want to go to Nha Trang." He says, "How come?" I said, "Well, Sergeant Ramirez, who was my mess sergeant in Fort Benning, told me to look you up and ask to go to Nha Trang." And he says, "Okay, I'll see what I can do." And sent me to Nha Trang. What do you know? And the job that they had open for my military specialty was with the 5th Special Forces. I was a helicopter repair parts specialist, and I was responsible for making certain that the thousands of parts necessary to keep a helicopter in the air were available at all times. Unfortunately, the system didn't work very well, and what I eventually did was learn how to steal all the parts that were necessary to keep our helicopters flying. But that's a little bit different story. I'm using up a lot more time doing this than I had intended. I haven't even gotten to Vietnam yet. So anyhow, after I went to while I was in Fort Benning, I enlisted for a specialty to become a helicopter repair parts specialist, and the training for that specialty was at Fort Lee, Virginia, where I went for several months after basic training, and I was on leave the month of December of 1967 before going to Vietnam in January of 1968. So I'm going to get to Vietnam just in time for the Tet Offensive, the biggest, baddest offensive of the entire Vietnam War. Before I got there and after I left, Tet Offensive, height. So a funny thing for a draft resistor and a war protester to get drafted and then sent to Vietnam just in time for Tet. But I had my peculiarities. I'm the only guy I ever heard of who actually took a guitar to Vietnam. But that's a different story. I'll tell you in another episode. So anyhow, I'm coming up on 15 minutes, so I guess I'll say ta-ta for now, and I'll pick you up in another version. Thank you for watching. Oh, if you like it, you might want to like this episode, subscribe to this channel. I got a long story. Bye now.